a proposal to tighten EU migration policy. Negotiators from the European Parliament and Council have provisionally agreed on a new deal. It includes the deportation to third countries of people whose applications are rejected. But where would that leave the rights of those seeking safe haven in Europe? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. Return hubs, a new term in the proposed changes to the European Union's migration policy. It refers to a third country where the EU would send people ordered to leave the bloc, a third country to which the migrants, refugees or asylum seekers may have no connection. If the proposal becomes law, it would add to already adopted measures aiming to tighten the rules allowing people to enter the EU. Human rights groups have rejected the proposal, saying so-called return hubs would be legal black holes. Well, critics accuse the EU of ignoring its commitment to protecting refugees. Others argue the document reflects the increase in anti-immigration sentiment that's fuelling support for far-right parties across Europe. So how likely are the European Parliament and European Council to pass these regulations? And if they are passed, how will they be enforced? We will talk to our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
Rights activists and critics have referred to the EU as Fortress Europe, referring to its increasingly strict border controls. Some politicians say unregulated migration is a problem.
We see now only 28% was really leaving the European Union. That means that 72% is still staying in the European Union, often to travel to other member states, secondary movement, staying illegally.
Malik Asmani is part of a group of right-wing parties pushing for tighter migration policy. Proposals include member states enforcing each other's deportation rulings, more forced returns, and stricter measures to prevent people from absconding, for example by asking for financial guarantees or dictating where people live. The new legislation would also allow EU countries to deport people to so-called return hubs. This would apply when an asylum application is denied, but the person cannot legally be returned to their own country. Under the proposal, they would be sent to a third location outside the EU. EU members would be expected to fund these return hubs. Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark and Greece are reportedly working to find locations, while Italy already has a similar scheme in place with Albania. The European Commission tabled the proposal last year. Opponents say it will make it easier to violate human rights and the EU Charter. They've also questioned the legality of the rules.
The overall architecture of the regulation, which pushes towards more enforcement, more deportations, potentially more coercion and violence, which is of course very similar to what we see in the US.
Right-wing politicians say it's what voters want. They've been pushing for tighter rules since the right increased power in Europe in 2024. But they make no mention of the fact that irregular arrivals to the EU fell 26% last year to the lowest level since 2021. The proposal still requires formal approval by EU governments and the European Parliament. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera.
OK, let's bring in our guests now. Joining us from Brussels is Marta, Welander, EU Advocacy Director at the International Rescue Committee. In Frankfurt is Susan Fratzke, Senior Policy Analyst at the Migration Policy Institute and the organisation's lead on migrant protection and returns. And in Nairobi is Demas Kiprono. He is a human rights lawyer and Executive Director of the International Commission of Jurists in Kenya. Thank you so much for being with us here on Inside Story today. We really do appreciate your time and really looking forward to this discussion. Susan, if I can begin with you, please. How would you define or describe a return hub, and why do you think that the EU believes it needs this at this point in time?
Sure, it's an excellent question, because I think return hubs are one of those concepts that is still very much in flux and means different things to different people and to different countries. But at the moment, the way that this concept is being discussed is essentially as some kind of an agreement and a center that would exist in a third country outside of Europe that EU member states could return people to, even if they're not a national of that country. And the aim would be to use this in particular to return people who can't be returned to their country of origin for various reasons, usually because there's a lack of cooperation with the country of origin. And this would be another place that the person could be brought to better enable the EU member state to enforce that return order, even if they don't have the cooperation or agreement of the country of origin or there are other barriers in place. So that's the general concept as it's currently understood.
OK. Marta, the EU says only around about 28% of people that have been ordered to leave the EU actually do. Does that suggest that the current system really isn't working and that something fundamentally does have to change?
Well, as an organization that works to support people caught in crisis in over 40 countries and across the entire arc of displacement crisis, the IRC is deeply concerned about the impact on return hubs and on the people and communities that we support. Whether or not the current system is working is a different question, but what we are faced with now is an unviable system that is based essentially on return hubs, on deportation centers set up outside of EU territory. And in practice, this means that the creation of these hubs would lead to people being deported beyond EU territory, oftentimes to countries to which they have no personal connection or have never set foot before, whilst they're waiting for further steps. So indeed, the EU is seeking solutions to its situation, but we would argue that this is not the right solution because it will not guarantee protection of human rights safeguards for the individuals concerned.
OK. Demas, from your point of view, when the EU says it needs to outsource its migration management to third countries, what does that actually look like from the receiving end, from the countries that could potentially be setting up these return hubs?
Just looking at the countries that are proposed to be these return hubs, looking at their socioeconomic situation, you realize that most likely these bilateral arrangements are going to be quite exploitative because of the imbalance in power. So that you find that countries are keen, in the global south especially, are keen to get into these arrangements to receive people, but there are other implications, including human rights implications. But I'd like to pause for a moment and think about, for example, East Africa, where Kenya hosts about 850,000 people. Uganda hosts 1.5 million. We are already swamped in terms of asylum seekers and refugees. And I would imagine that having such arrangements is making a bad situation even worse. But further than that, Europe speaks of the post-1948 rules-based order. And part of that rules-based order is the Refugee Convention and the Convention Against Torture. And we find that these arrangements really erode on principles such as non-refoulement because there are no guarantees about the human rights situations in these so-called receiving hubs.
OK, how big a worry is that there are no guarantees, Susan, around how people will be treated in these hubs? And do you think that this is a lot of this is just really down to politics at play, that the European leaders are simply doing what the European public is asking them to do?
Sure. So with regard to the agreements and what might be guaranteed in the third country where someone would be returned to, the returns regulation as it currently stands, the text that's been agreed, does require that EU member states should base any third country returns to a future return hub on a agreement with the partner country that should specify in detail what the conditions and treatment would be of the person at origin and at the country of destination, so the third country where they're returned to, and that as much as possible, the EU member states should ensure that those conditions are compliant with international and EU law. There should also be monitoring bodies that are set up as part of that agreement to ensure compliance with international law and with EU law. So in theory, there should be guarantees about the conditions in the third country. I think where there's a lot of concern is the extent to which that can and will be upheld in practice. So will independent monitors in practice be able to get access to these places and ensure the conditions? Will the countries, the third countries who host a hub, be able to ensure conditions? What will happen to someone after they're returned if they can't be returned on to their country of origin? So there's a lot that remains uncertain about the actual implementation. Regarding the politics, absolutely. I think this is largely a political priority for member states. They see this as something that they can really use to address a lot of the doubts and public concerns that exist around migration, particularly around the low return rates that you had mentioned earlier. So this is very much a political objective, I think even more so than a practical one.
Marta, you said that this is an unviable system earlier, but according to EU Migration Commissioner Magnus Brunner, the new rules give authorities more control over who can come to the EU, who can stay and who actually needs to leave. What would a good, viable system look like in your eyes, do you think?
Yes, so our organization really advocates for more investment in strong asylum systems that can lead to effective outcomes. We need more investment in effective reception and protection within Europe itself. So indeed, we would like to see investment in supporting people to rebuild their lives rather than an ever greater focus on keeping people out at all costs. So to tie into what the previous speaker also highlighted in regard to concerns about implementation, while the agreement does state that any third country agreement must respect international human rights standards and so forth, including the principle of non-refoulement, the experience does show that accountability and oversight often become more difficult when migration management is moved beyond EU borders. So this is really a key concern, and we don't believe that further deterrence and externalization would lead to a better system.
As we know, the idea for so-called return hubs is not new. The UK tried to set up a scheme with Rwanda, and Italy is already running something similar. Italy runs and pays for 2 migration centres in Albania, which is not yet part of the EU. Initially, it sent people to Albania who had been intercepted at sea, but changed to sending people already in Italy and under expulsion orders. The scheme has faced repeated legal problems over EU asylum safeguards, safe country rules, as well as detention rights. This forced it to redefine how it functions. The UK tried to set up a scheme to send asylum seekers directly to Rwanda to process their claim. However, it was beset with legal challenges and was eventually dropped. OK, Susan, obviously the UK has tried this. It has failed. Italy is still attempting to try and get this, something similar across the line. Why would these return hubs be any different, or are they just going to be face exactly the same legal challenges, do you think?
Sure. Legal challenges are a major concern as EU member states are looking at return hubs and other externalized strategies. As you mentioned, there have been legal challenges to other similar measures that have been put in place before. It's worth noting that the new returns regulation and the way that member states are proposing return hubs has been designed in a way that is fairly careful to try to avoid legal challenges in the future. So there are a couple of key differences to some of the examples you mentioned previously. So first, as opposed to UK Rwanda or Italy Albania, return hubs would only apply to individuals who have already gone through an asylum process and had their claims for international protection denied, which means they're subject to fewer protections under international and EU law. And the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, for example, has stated that there are circumstances under which, if this is applying only to individuals who have no right to asylum, these can be legal and compliant, at least with the Refugee Convention. As I mentioned earlier, the regulation also specifies that these arrangements have to be done via transparent agreements with third countries that account for things like the human rights conditions in the country, the status someone would receive, conditions on the ground, independent monitoring, all of these sorts of things, which generally should help to support compliance with international law. Of course, as I said, we'll have to see in practice what that means. I imagine there will also still be legal challenges, particularly around things like detention. If someone is put in detention when they're actually transferred, there's a risk of prolonged detention, which could lead to violations. But in principle, this is meant to be designed to overcome some of these challenges we've seen in the past.
Right. Demas, as Susan brought up there, the issue of prolonged detention, I mean, there's been a lot of concern raised about the chances of people being trapped in this prolonged illegal limbo with no real clear pathway to return, integration or resolution at all. What does international law actually say about that, and how big a concern is that for you?
It's a big concern, first of all, because the whole plan could be aligned with all these intricate rules and regulations. But once you hit the ground, once a person is inside the system, it will be very hard for that person to claim their rights, and in some instances, even hard to lay a legal challenge to what is going on, because it would just actually be too late to help such a person. And so it would be, as was earlier stated, it would be very important to ensure that the receiving country, if that was ever allowed, which we really do not think is plausible, should have a stellar human rights record. However, looking around most of the receiving regions, you find that there are systemic human rights issues that have to be addressed. And indeed, the situations and conditions of detention introduce another layer of concern, where the person would be very far away from legal protections. And basically be too late for them in a country that they do not have any relation or familiarity with. Thank you.
Marta, do we know how widespread this is going to be? I mean, some of the people affected will no doubt have spent years in Europe. They'll have children in schools, jobs, families there. Can you just give us an idea of the scale of this problem?
Yes, no, absolutely. It would risk affecting vast numbers of people across Europe who will, as you said, have spent years in EU member states, who have started rebuilding their lives, created families, and become part of the fabric of these communities. And indeed, the new return regulation, including the agreement on return hubs, really risk uprooting a lot of people, and this would have far-reaching implications on the human lives. And we could see uprooting from communities, family separation, disruption of support networks, and further trauma, frankly, for people who would already have most likely experienced conflict, persecution, violence, or other reasons for displacement. And we also have particular concerns about children and other vulnerable individuals in this context. We have concerns about how in practice they would be identified and protected in practice within this framework. Even where exemptions do exist on paper, the experience shows that safeguards can be very difficult to implement effectively, and that really creates big risks for, that vulnerable individuals will fall through the cracks when it comes to implementation.
Yeah, Susan, the EU often presents itself as a global champion of human rights. I mean, it often lectures others on the subject. So is what we're seeing here with this proposed law, do you see it as hypocritical?
I think that that is certainly something that will be put forward to the EU, particularly as it comes into negotiations with partner countries. As you said, the EU tries to champion human rights law. It puts itself forward as a champion of human rights law. But there's certainly a perception in many of the states that we've spoken with who have been identified as potential partners for these arrangements that this is somewhat hypocritical and is shifting responsibility to states that don't necessarily have the resources to deal with it. And I think that this is something that the EU really needs to bear in mind as it tries to enter these agreements, is how they're being perceived by the potential partner countries. Because right now, I think this is often coming across as very transactional rather than something that's driven by the values-oriented framework that the EU has tried to uphold in the past.
Demas, there's a number of countries that have been reportedly under consideration here. Rwanda, Uganda, Libya, Mauritania, to name a few. Nothing confirmed as of yet. I mean, many of those countries face their own harsh economic pressures, which obviously makes EU money attractive. But what are the social and political risks within these countries in taking something like this on?
Well, one of the social and political risks is already stretching countries that are quite stretched. If you look at even their detention centers and gauge it towards international standards, you find that they are quite wanting. However, there are those safeguards that have been mentioned, and then there are the other dynamics of you've mentioned African countries with very different ethnic makeups that might really complicate the lives of the people who are already there. The other layer is that some of these countries that we mentioned already have a lot of refugees and asylum seekers. And perhaps we would urge Europe to think about where these laws came from in the first place. The UN Refugee Act and the Convention Against Torture are instruments that came out of the experience that was mainly in Europe post 1948, and the need to protect the people who are seeking asylum. And so perhaps we should find more concrete ways to ensure that we are not just transferring or responsibility in terms of asylum, but really dealing with things at the root cause. Thank you.
Marta, the political argument goes that this is actually going to send a message, these return hubs, that if you come to Europe, you may be sent elsewhere to a country that you've never been to or have no connection to. Do you think that that's going to be a deterrent?
Not quite. I think, indeed, the political appeal of return hubs is obvious. They are intended to send, as you said, the message that if you come here regularly to seek protection, you will be transferred elsewhere. However, the evidence that such policies actually create a significant deterrent effect is much weaker than what politicians tend to suggest. And this is, of course, because many people fleeing conflict, persecution, violence, or extreme entrenched poverty, they do not tend to make decisions based on detailed knowledge of European migration policies. The primary concern is, of course, safety, survival, and the future of their families. So we really need to remember these realities and also the realities of migration journeys. Through the IRC's work with displaced people across countries, we see so many people who are seeking protection who have already risked putting their lives in the hands of smugglers. They've undertaken dangerous sea crossings and so forth. They've been subjected to violence. So if someone is willing to risk their lives drowning in the Mediterranean, the prospect of being transferred to a return hub may not really fundamentally alter their decision. So I think deterrence policies in general often assume this level of choice, information, and rational calculation that is not really always a reality of those who are forcibly displaced.
Susan, obviously a lot of this has been pushed by the right and the far right parties as they've gained popularity within Europe. Do you think that concepts and ideas and policies like this are going to continue for Europe at this point?
I do think that the change in trajectory of European policy on migration is likely to be durable, at least over the short to medium term. We've seen migration and more restrictive migration policies be adopted as part of party platforms, not just on the right or even the center right, but also on the left. If you look at the coalition agreements that have been reached recently in countries like Germany, or the political platform, for example, in the UK, which of course is not an EU member, but still part of Europe, they all, even on the center left, incorporate many of these more restrictive elements. And one of the countries that has been championing these types of solutions is actually Denmark, which up until a couple of months ago was led by a center-left political party. So I think this is a change that is here to stay, at least in the next few years.
Okay, Demas, we've got about a minute or so remaining in this discussion. If not return hubs, if that's not an option, then what? What is a solution that's actually going to be workable and honest about Europe's obligations? What would that actually look like, do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to look at where these people are coming from, right? There are patterns that can be seen, and there are interventions that certain economic powers and economic programs that can do to perhaps encourage people to stay in their countries. However, once the asylum laws does not know that. It knows that if someone is fleeing persecution, is fleeing extreme poverty, and lands on your doorstep, you need to find ways within international law to deal with that. And we are in the rules-based order. We are all trying to keep is to ensure that such obligations are kept by those countries, especially the countries that keep saying that human rights is important and lecturing others about human rights.
Thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. We unfortunately are out of time. Marta, Welander, Susan Fratzke and Demas Kiprono, we do appreciate your time, your insight here today on Inside Story. Thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That is aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that is all from me, Tom McRae, and the entire team here. Al Jazeera's coverage will continue in just a moment. Do stay tuned.